There is a stretch of water at the mouth of Tampa Bay where two fishing piers point at each other from opposite shores and do not meet. They are the ends of a road that used to run across the bay. On a clear day, you can stand at the end of the southern pier, look north across the shipping channel, and see the exact place where the old highway stopped being a highway and became a 150-foot drop into open water. For most of the morning of May 9, 1980, that drop did not exist. Then, for about 30 seconds, it did. And then 35 people were gone. This is the story of the day the Sunshine Skyway fell into Tampa Bay. It is not a story about a bridge that was badly built, because the bridge was not badly built. It is not a story about a captain who was reckless, because the man at the wheel was one of the most respected pilots on the bay. It is a story about how fast an ordinary Friday morning can turn into the worst disaster in the history of American bridges, and about the thin line, measured in feet and in seconds, between the people who drove across that morning and never thought about it again, and the ones who did not make it to the other side. Let me tell you what the Sunshine Skyway was before that morning, because you cannot understand what was lost without understanding what stood there. The original Skyway opened in 1954, a single two-lane span crossing the lower end of Tampa Bay and connecting St. Petersburg on the north shore with Bradenton and the land to the south. It was popular enough that a second parallel span was added in 1971, so that by 1980 there were two bridges side by side, one carrying northbound traffic and one carrying southbound. Together they carried Highway 19 across nearly 4 miles of water. The bridges were a cantilever design. At the center, where the shipping channel ran underneath, the roadway rose to about 150 feet above the water to let freighters pass beneath it. That high central section was held up by a steel truss and supported on concrete piers sunk into the floor of the bay. It was, by the standards of its time, a normal bridge. Thousands of cars crossed it every day. Commuters used it. Truckers used it. Greyhound buses running the length of Florida used it. Nobody who drove across the Skyway on a normal morning gave the piers underneath it a second thought, because there was no reason to. The piers had one weakness that nobody was thinking about that morning, and it was this: there was almost nothing protecting them from the ships passing below. Now let me tell you about the ship. The Summit Venture was a bulk carrier, a little over 600 feet long, registered in Liberia, built to haul phosphate and other dry cargo. On the morning of May 9th, she was empty. She had come into Tampa Bay to load, not to unload, which matters more than it sounds, because an empty ship rides high in the water. Her hull sat up on the surface like a wall, and a wall that size catches the wind. A loaded ship sits low and holds its line. An empty one gets pushed around. The Summit Venture was riding high, and she was about to sail into a wind that no forecast had warned anyone about. The man guiding her up the bay was John Lero. He was 37 years old, a harbor pilot, which is a specific and demanding job that most people have never heard of. When a large ship enters a port, the ship's own captain does not steer it through the harbor. A local pilot comes aboard, someone who knows the channel by heart, every buoy and bend and current, and that pilot takes command of the ship's movements until it is safely docked. Lero had done this run up Tampa Bay many times. He had a reputation as careful and skilled. On paper, there was no better person to have on that bridge wing that morning. The channel he had to thread was 58 miles long from the Gulf to the port, and the tightest, most demanding part of the whole run was the passage under the Skyway, where he had to line the ship up and take her through the gap between the piers with very little room on either side. At around 7 in the morning, the Summit Venture was making her way inbound. The weather was gray but manageable. The most recent forecast, issued by the National Weather Service at 5:30 that morning, had told mariners to expect light winds and cool temperatures. There was no warning of anything severe. There was no small craft advisory, no squall line on anyone's chart. What was actually forming out over the Gulf was a violent thunderstorm cell, and it was moving toward the bay. And nobody had told the men on the water it was coming. This is the first thing that has to be understood about that morning. Lero was not driving into a storm he had ignored. He was driving into a storm that officially did not exist. As the ship approached the bridge, the sky closed in. The rain came first, then harder, then in sheets. The wind climbed fast, past 40 miles an hour toward 60 and beyond. Visibility, which had been a couple of miles, collapsed to almost nothing. Lero could no longer see the bridge he was aiming for. He could not see the buoys marking the channel. In that situation, a pilot leans on his radar, and here the storm took the second thing away from him. The rain was so heavy that it cluttered the radar screen with returns, a wall of static where the shoreline and the channel markers should have been. He was now approaching one of the tightest passages on the bay, in a ship that caught the wind like a sail, with no visibility and no reliable radar, and a following wind shoving him toward the bridge. He had a decision to make, and only seconds to make it, and every option was bad. He could try to turn the ship around, but a 600-foot vessel does not turn on a dime, and attempting a turn in that channel with that wind could have swung the stern into the piers just as easily as the bow. He could drop anchor and try to stop. But an empty ship being pushed by 60-mile-an-hour wind does not stop quickly, and dropping anchor at speed in a narrow channel carries its own dangers. Or he could hold his course and try to run the gap, betting that he was still lined up. He held course. For a few seconds it might have worked. Then, right as the ship should have been sliding cleanly through the opening, the storm shoved her sideways. The bow came out of the rain not in the center of the channel but off to one side, pointed directly at a support pier of the southbound span. There was no time left to do anything about it. At about 7:34 in the morning, the Summit Venture struck the pier. A ship that size carries an enormous amount of energy even at slow speed. And the pier was never built to take a blow like that. It failed. And when the pier went, the roadway it was holding up had nothing left underneath it. Roughly 1,200 feet of the southbound bridge, more than a quarter of a mile of highway, tore loose and fell. Steel and concrete that had been 150 feet in the air came down into Tampa Bay and onto the deck of the ship in a matter of seconds. From the water it looked like the top of the bridge had simply been erased. Now here is the part that is hard to think about, and it is the reason this disaster stays in people's memory the way it does. It was rush hour. Cars and a bus were on that span when it fell. The drivers coming up the incline could not see through the rain either. They came over the rise in the road at highway speed and found that the road in front of them was no longer there. There was no barrier, no time, no warning. A pickup truck, several cars, and a Greyhound bus drove straight off the broken edge into the gap where the bridge used to be. The Greyhound was running from the north down toward Miami, with a stop in St. Petersburg behind it. The driver was Michael Curtin, 43 years old, a professional who had been with the company for years. He had a bus full of people, passengers heading home, heading to family, heading to work, ordinary travelers on an ordinary run down the length of Florida. The bus went over the edge and fell 150 feet into the bay. The driver and every passenger aboard were killed. Around it, the cars went too. In total, 35 people died in those few seconds, most of them never knowing what had happened. One moment they were driving through heavy rain, the next the road was gone. And then there is Wesley McIntyre, and the reason we know his name is that he is the only person who went off that bridge and lived. McIntyre was driving a small Ford Courier pickup, on his way to a job at a meat delivery business. He had just tossed his coins into the toll basket and started across the span when the rain turned savage. He came up the incline and drove off the broken edge like the others. His truck fell toward the ship, struck the hull, and was thrown off it into the water, and somehow, in all of that, he was thrown clear. He surfaced in Tampa Bay, injured and in shock, in churning water 150 feet below where a highway had been a minute earlier, and he stayed afloat until he was pulled out alive. He was the only one. Everyone else who went over the edge was gone. Think for a second about what that fall actually was. The roadway had stood 150 feet above the water. That is roughly the height of a 15-story building. The people in those cars and in that bus went off the edge at driving speed and dropped the length of a skyscraper into the channel, most of them still strapped into their seats, most of them with no idea the road had even ended. For McIntyre to come through that, to have his truck strike the side of a moving freighter, get thrown off it, and still put him into the water alive and conscious enough to keep his head up, is the kind of thing that has no explanation beyond luck of a size that is almost unbearable to think about, given how many people around him had none of it at all. On the ship, John Larrow had already done the one thing left to do. Even before the full weight of what had happened was clear, he was on the radio. He called out a mayday, reporting that the Skyway was down, that vehicles were in the water, and begging for the Coast Guard and for boats, for anyone who could get out there, and warning that traffic still coming had to be stopped before more cars drove into the gap behind the ones that had already fallen. He could see, from the bridge wing of the Summit Venture, the broken end of the highway above him and the debris in the water. He would say later that he saw a vehicle come off the edge. The pilot who had just been at the controls of the ship that knocked the bridge down was now the man calling for help and trying to keep the death toll from climbing. Traffic on the bridge was stopped. The gap took no more victims after that. What followed was a rescue operation that quickly became a recovery operation. Boats and helicopters converged on the channel in the storm. They pulled McIntyre from the water. They found the ship sitting under the broken span with pieces of the bridge on her deck. And then, over the hours and days that followed, they began the grim work of bringing up the cars and the bus and the people inside them from the bottom of the bay. Divers went down into vehicles that had fallen 150 feet and come to rest in the dark water of the channel. The Greyhound was located and raised. The scale of it settled over the region slowly, the way these things do. One recovered vehicle at a time, one name at a time. For the people of St. Petersburg and Bradenton, this was not a distant news story. It was a bridge they crossed. It was the road they took to work and to the beach and to their families on the other side of the bay. Many of them had driven over that exact span in the days before, and some of them had loved ones who used it every morning. And for a while, nobody knew whose cars were in the water and whose were not. The bus alone carried more than 20 passengers, people traveling down the length of the state who had boarded expecting nothing more than a long ride to Miami. Every one of them had a family somewhere waiting for a phone call that turned out to be the wrong kind of call. That is the arithmetic of a disaster like this. It is not 35 as a number on a page. It is 35 households, each one learning on the same gray Friday that the person they expected home was not coming. The question that the public wanted answered immediately was the obvious one. Whose fault was this? And this is where the story stops being simply about a storm and becomes about a man. Because in the days after the disaster, John Larrow became one of the most hated people in Florida. He was the pilot. He had the con. The ship under his command had knocked down a bridge and killed 35 people, and to a grieving public that was the beginning and the end of it. He received threats. His name became shorthand for the tragedy, and he had to live inside a fact that no verdict could ever lift off him, which was that whatever the cause, his ship had done it, and he had been the one steering. The official investigations, though, saw something more complicated than a simple case of a pilot at fault. The evidence laid out a chain of things going wrong that no single person had controlled. The storm that had not been forecast, the wind that came up out of nowhere and reached speeds that could push an empty ship off her line, the rain that blinded both the pilot and his radar at the worst possible moment, in the tightest part of the channel. The National Transportation Safety Board examined all of it and split on the question of blame, ruling that Lero bore some responsibility, but that the weather and the circumstances had contributed heavily to what happened. A grand jury declined to charge him with any crime. The state board that governed harbor pilots let him keep his license. In the eyes of the law and of the investigators, this was not the story of a man who had been careless. It was the story of a man who had been handed an impossible situation in a matter of seconds, and had, if anything, done about as well as anyone could have in choosing among options that were all terrible. None of that saved John Lero. He tried to go back to work as a pilot, and he managed it for a short while. But within a year of the disaster he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and about 8 months later the illness forced him to give up piloting for good. He sank into depression. He carried the disaster with him every day for the rest of his life. But what he did with the years that followed is the part of his story that too often gets left out. He did not disappear into bitterness. He trained as a counselor. He worked with criminals and with rape victims, people carrying their own weight of trauma and shame. He volunteered on a suicide hotline, talking strangers through the worst nights of their lives. A man whom the public had cast as a villain spent his last decades quietly trying to help other people survive their own darkness. He died in 2002 of complications from the multiple sclerosis that had ended his career. Some of the people who came to understand his story call him the 36th victim of the Skyway. He was not on the bridge, and he was not in the water. But the disaster took his life too. It just took longer. Wesley McIntyre, the one survivor, carried his own version of the same weight. Living through something that killed everyone else around you is not the clean gift it sounds like. He struggled for years with the question of why he had come out of that water when the bus full of people had not. He lived 9 more years after the fall. Friends said he never fully recovered from it. The morning on the bridge stayed with him until the end. Surviving the Skyway was not the same as escaping it. While the people were still living inside the disaster, the state had to decide what to do about the bridge. The southbound span was destroyed. The northbound span still stood, but it had watched its twin fall. And its piers had the same weakness, the same lack of protection from the ships passing below. For a few years, traffic in both directions shared the surviving span while the state figured out the future. And the decision they reached was not to rebuild what had been there. It was to build something that could not fall the way the old one had. The new Sunshine Skyway, the one that stands today, is a cable-stayed bridge. Its roadway hung from cables that fanned down from 2 tall towers painted bright yellow. Construction began in 1984, and the bridge opened in 1987 at a cost of around $244 million. It was designed to be more than just newer. It was designed around the exact failure that had killed 35 people. The main piers of the new bridge are ringed by what engineers call dolphins, large protective barriers of concrete built out in the water around the supports. The idea is brutally simple. If a ship ever comes out of the channel again, off its line, pushed by a wind nobody saw coming, it hits the barrier and not the bridge. The barrier is meant to absorb the blow and stop the ship before it can reach the pier that holds up the road. The thing that had no protection in 1980 now has a wall of it. and the old bridge did not entirely disappear. Rather than tear the approaches down and haul them away, the state left the two long, low ends standing and turned them into fishing piers. Those are the piers pointing at each other across the water. People drive out onto them today, cast lines into the bay, and watch the tall yellow towers of the new bridge carry traffic across the same gap where the old road fell. Most of them are not thinking about May 9, 1980, any more than the commuters that morning were thinking about the piers beneath their tires. That is the nature of these places. They hold enormous events lightly, and the water gives nothing away. Here is what I keep coming back to with the Skyway. Almost nothing about that morning was the result of a single bad decision by a single careless person. That is what makes it frightening rather than simply sad. A forecast that called for calm. A storm cell nobody detected. A wind that arrived at the exact wrong minute, in the exact wrong place, and pushed an empty ship a few degrees off a line she had held 100 times. A radar screen washed out by rain right when it was needed most. A pilot with seconds to choose among options that were all bad, who chose and was wrong, and would have been wrong with any of the other choices too. And on top of the bridge, drivers who could not see far enough ahead to know the road had ended, coming up the incline at speed into a gap that had opened only moments before they reached it. Every one of those things, on its own, was survivable. The forecast is wrong all the time, and nothing happens. Ships get pushed by wind and correct and carry on. Rain blinds a radar and clears a minute later. Cars drive through storms every single day. The disaster was not any one of those failures. It was all of them landing on the same 30 seconds, in the same few hundred feet of channel, under the same span of road, with rush hour traffic on top of it. That is how 35 people can leave home on a normal Friday and never come back. And how the man who was steering can be both responsible and blameless at the same time. And how a bridge that was perfectly ordinary can become the site of the worst structural disaster of its kind in the country. The new bridge stands because of what the old one taught. The dolphins in the water, the towers, the whole design, all of it exists because of a morning when a wall of rain, a gust of wind, and a few unprotected feet of concrete added up to a number, and the number was 35. The fishing piers still point at each other across the channel, ending where the road once ended. And out in the middle, where the water is deep and the ships still pass, there is nothing to mark the place at all. Just the bay and the boats going by. And a gap in the air 150 feet up where a highway used to be.